Imagine you are the head of a transnational corporation that in the 15th century calls itself the Church. You oversee the souls of millions of parishioners, a network of tax-collecting bishops, and a monopoly on the truth. However, your business is inefficient. The Eastern branch in Constantinople is taking a share of the profits, while competitors in Avignon undermine the authority of the unified brand. This fragmentation threatens bankruptcy as cash flows begin to bypass your Venetian vaults. One secret decision allows you to merge assets. You hand over Constantinople to new managers in turbans, but retain trading privileges and control over financial flows. What will you choose? To save the faithful at the cost of losing capital, or simply to change the signage on the temples so that taxes from the conquered lands continue to flow into your treasury, albeit through another administration? We are told that the year 1453 is just a date, a convenient marker in the history textbook. The Ottomans captured Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire ceased to exist. A new era begins. Everything makes sense. Everything is clear. The school curriculum fits into a single paragraph. But open a map of Europe from that time and take a close look at what was happening during this period, not in one place, but in several. The version cracks at the seams. Take the chronology of this year and write down the events on a piece of paper. On May 29th, Constantinople falls, the capital of an empire that has stood for over 1,000 years. On July 17th, the 100 Years' War between England and France officially comes to an end, a conflict that exhausted both nations and lasted for 116 years. In the same year, the popes finally return from Avignon, where they had been since the year 1309. However, they do not return to the Lateran Palace, where they resided before leaving, but to a new location, the Vatican. 3 global political events. Simultaneously, over the course of several months, at different ends of Europe. Coincidence? Take a calendar and count the days. From the 29th of May to the 17th of July, 49 days. Less than 2 months between the fall of Constantinople and the end of the longest medieval war. Count for yourself. In an era when news traveled at the speed of a horse, a maximum of 100 kilometers a day on a good road, and that in ideal conditions, synchronizing decisions in Paris, London, Rome, and Constantinople required months of preparation and coordination. The distance from Constantinople to Paris over land is more than 2,500 kilometers. Through the Balkans, Hungary, Germany. The roads of that time are dirt tracks, eroded by rain. In winter, they are impassable. In summer, they are dusty. Bridges are rare. Crossings are dangerous. It's realistically possible to cover no more than 50 to 70 kilometers a day if one changes horses at every station and does not sleep. So at least a month one way, 2 months round trip. And there is also the time needed for the King of France to gather a council, discuss the proposal, make a decision, and draft a response. A messenger from Constantinople wouldn't even be able to reach Paris in 49 days, not to mention the royal court reacting to the news and making the fateful decision to end a century-long conflict. This doesn't add up. So the decision to end the war was made in advance, before the fall of Constantinople, as if someone knew what would happen in May and was preparing the world for change, as if the events were planned. The most obvious explanation is a mere coincidence of dates. Okay, then answer one question. Why in the same year do the popes move back, not to where they left? The Lateran Palace stood empty. It had been their residence until the so-called Avignon captivity, which lasted almost 70 years. A huge complex of buildings, fully equipped for the needs of the papal court. But no, they settle in the Vatican, in a new place, on the other side of the Tiber River. As if the old map of the world had stopped working and a new headquarters was needed for a new era. Three centers of power change course synchronously. Paris ends a war that seemed endless. Rome changes its residence, although there is no practical necessity for it. Constantinople falls, despite having every chance to endure. And here's the question. Who gave the command? Who stood behind the thrones? Who coordinated these changes? Open the chronicles of the late 14th century, the period from 1378 to 1417, spans almost 40 years of chaos. In Europe, there are two popes. One resides in the Vatican, the other in Avignon, in the south of modern-day France. Historians refer to this as the Great Western Schism. The cardinals cannot agree on who is the legitimate head of the church. Both popes excommunicate each other. Each appoints his own cardinals, creates his own curia, collects taxes, and excommunicates the objectionable. Europe is split in two. Some countries recognize the Roman Pope, while others recognize the Avignon Pope. Now look at Rus, the years 1378 to 1390. Two metropolitans, Cyprian and Philemon, one in Moscow, the other claiming the same throne. Both consider themselves the legitimate heads of the Russian Church. Both are awaiting confirmation from Constantinople. Both have their supporters among the princes. Both are collecting tithes. The same scheme as in the West. Carefully compare the dates. The Great Schism in the West begins in 1378. The Schism of the Metropolis in Rus, also 1378. The Battle of Kulikovo, 1380. The death of Metropolitan Alexius, who effectively ruled Rus under the underage Dmitry Donskoy, also occurred in 1378. Everything begins at the same time, in 1 year, as if someone has initiated a process synchronously at different points. This is handwriting. This is a system. How were metropolitans appointed then? Not through prayer or by the choice of the faithful, not by the decision of the local church. It was a joint decree of the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine Emperor. Two people in Constantinople decided who would be the spiritual leader in Rus, 3,000 kilometers away from them. The Moscow prince didn't even formally have the right to appoint his own metropolitan. The decision was made in Constantinople. And this decision often depended not on the candidate's holiness, not on his education, not on his merits before the church, but on the size of the bribe he could offer. Look further. Before the Battle of Kulikovo, Metropolitan Alexius passed away, a man who effectively ruled the Principality of Moscow while Prince Dmitry was still a minor. Alexius controlled finances, foreign policy, and appointed people to key positions. His word was law. And now he has left this world. Power hangs in the air. 4 candidates are heading to Constantinople for the blessing on the appointment of the Metropolitan. 4. Mityai, the spiritual advisor of Prince Dmitry himself, his personal choice. Pimen, a representative of one of the boyar factions. Cyprian, a candidate from another party. Dionysius, yet another contender. Mitya did not reach Constantinople. He perished on the way under mysterious circumstances. The other three made it to the capital of Byzantium. And here's an astonishing thing. All three will, in turn, become the metropolitans of Moscow and all Rus. Pimen will receive the blessing first. Then he will be replaced by Kirill. Then Kirill will be removed, and Pimen will be reinstated. After that, it will be Dionysius's turn. 4 candidates went. 4, one way or another, got a position. What is the probability of such a coincidence? This is not a choice of a spiritual leader. It is an auction. The position is sold to the one who pays the most, who offers Constantinople the best terms, who promises more gold in the form of regular contributions, who grants more privileges to Greek merchants on Russian lands, who assures greater control for Constantinople over local politics. Officially, this is explained as follows. The Church is a spiritual authority, and there can be no such cynical trading of positions here. Fair enough. So where did the term simony come from? The sale of church offices. This is the official name of the sin that the Church itself condemned. It is named after Simon the sorcerer from the Acts of the Apostles, who attempted to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit from the apostles. This means that the phenomenon was so widespread that they invented a separate name for it, so prevalent that the Church was forced to condemn it, even though it practiced it itself. And now look at Pskov and Novgorod. The year is 1375. A rebellion of the Strigolniks breaks out there, a religious movement about which almost nothing is known today. The Church spent centuries erasing all traces. It destroyed documents, rewrote chronicles, and erased names. But one detail still remains in the records. The Strigolniks were outraged by the appointment of pastors through bribery. They publicly shouted that church positions were being sold like goods at a market, that one could become a priest not by calling, but simply by paying the required sum to the bishop. They were executed, thrown into the Volvov River with stones around their necks, for the truth. Note the dates. Strigolnikov is executed in 1375. 3 years later, the schism of the metropolitans in Russia will begin. It's as if they first eliminated those who might protest too loudly against the new management scheme. And this is not just a local problem for Rus. In 1378, the Catholic Church splits in two. Cardinals in Rome elect Urban VI as pope. A stern, tough man, he immediately begins to purge the curia of corruption. The cardinals are unhappy with this. Many of them are French, accustomed to the gentle order of the Avignon court. They declare Urban's election invalid, claiming it was conducted under the pressure of the Roman crowd, which demanded an Italian pope. The same cardinals gather again and elect another pope, Clement VII, a Frenchman. Clement packs his things, takes part of the church treasury, and returns to Avignon. Urban remains in the Vatican. Both consider themselves the only legitimate representatives of Christ on earth. Both appoint their own cardinals. Both create their own curious. Both excommunicate each other from the church and all those who recognize their rival. The control system is breaking down synchronously. In Rome, in Constantinople, in Rus. Simultaneously. As if someone is pulling at invisible strings, undermining the foundations of church authority throughout the Christian world. But who? And most importantly, why? Open the medieval trade chronicles. Raise the documents of the Genoese and Venetian notaries. Study the routes of financial flows. And you will see, behind every metropolitan, behind every pope, behind every emperor, lie traces of silver. And these traces do not lead to monasteries or temples. They lead to the banking houses of Genoa and Venice, two city republics that in the 14th and 15th centuries controlled half of world trade. Trace the routes of the fugitives after lost battles. This is a very telling test. Where does a person run after defeat? To their own, to those who support them, to those who need them. Metropolitan Cyprian, who succeeded Paimon, is of Greek origin but had close ties with Genoese merchants who held trading posts in Crimea and the Black Sea. Metropolitan Paimon, whom Cyprian temporarily displaced, is associated with Venetian trade interests. Moscow during those years is an important hub of trade routes. Goods flow from the east to the west through it. Whoever controls the metropolitan influences trade, tariffs, and caravan routes. Now look at the Kulikovo field. Mamai, who is fighting against Dmitry Donskoy, retreats after his defeat, not into the steppes, not to Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, not to his fellow tribesmen, the Mongols. He flees to Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, the capital of Genoese Crimea. There, where his masters are waiting for him. The Genoese merchants who controlled the Crimean ports and funneled eastern goods into Europe through them. Tokhtamysh, who will completely destroy Moscow 2 years after the Battle of Kulikovo, also flees, not into the steppe after his defeats. He flees to Kiev, to the Catholics, to the representatives of Venetian interests in Eastern Europe. These are not random coincidences. These are markers of belonging. And here is the key moment that turns the entire picture around. Mamai is formally not a Khan. He is a temnik, bekliarbek, meaning a military leader, the prime minister. According to the laws of the Mongol Empire, only direct descendants of Genghis Khan, the Chinggisids, had the right to the Khan title. Mamai is not a Chinggisid. He could not legally claim the throne. But he controls Crimea, and Crimea is a golden mine. The Crimean ports in the 14th century are key points of the Great Silk Road. Through them, the Genoese transfer eastern goods to Europe. Silk from China, spices from India, precious stones from Persia, porcelain, carpets, weapons, slaves, huge flows of money. How did trade work in the 14th century? Caravans transported goods from India and China along land routes through Central Asia. They reached Crimea, where the goods were transferred onto ships. Genoese or Venetian galleys carried them further, across the Black Sea, the Bosporus, Constantinople, the Mediterranean, and finally to Italy. From there, the goods spread throughout Europe. The profit was fantastic. One batch of quality pepper or cinnamon could recoup the construction of a trading ship tenfold. A kilogram of nutmeg in Europe was worth as much as a kilogram of gold. People were killed for such money. Wars were started for such sums. Kings were overthrown and popes appointed for such prices. Genoa and Venice fought for a monopoly on Eastern trade as if for survival. It was not merely competition, it was a war to the death. Whoever controls the key junctions of trade routes controls the profit. And there were two key junctions, Crimea and Constantinople. Mamaj controlled Crimea. This means he was working for those who held the Crimean ports, for the Genoese. The most obvious explanation, the Battle of Kulikovo, is the struggle of Rus against the Mongol yoke. A great patriotic victory, a symbol of freedom and independence. The moment when the Russian princes finally united and defeated the invaders. All right, then explain a simple thing. Why, 2 years after this great victory, is Moscow completely defeated by Khan Toktamish? The city is captured in an assault, burned and plundered within 3 days. Thousands dead, thousands taken into slavery. Prince Dmitry Donskoy, the great victor, the hero of the Battle of Kulikovo, flees the capital even before the siege begins. He abandons the people. He departs to gather troops in Kostroma. Where was the union of princes that was supposedly gathered before the Battle of Kulikovo? Where are the squads that defeated the countless hordes of Mamai? Why did no one come to defend Moscow? Why wasn't there a second Kulikovo field, this time at the walls of the capital? Look at the details of the timeline. Dmitry Donskoy leaves Moscow before the siege. Metropolitan Cyprian, the head of the Russian church and spiritual shepherd, abandons his flock and also flees. Both leave the city to its fate. Toktamish captures Moscow by deception, promising mercy if the gates are opened. The townspeople believe him. They open the gates. The troops burst in and begin the slaughter. They pillage for 3 days straight. They burn. They kill. They take people away. And then a strange thing happens. Dmitry Donskoy returns to the devastated Moscow and makes an unexpected move. He appoints Pimen as the new metropolitan, the very same Pimen whom he had kept in captivity for over a year before this, whom he considered an impostor and usurper, whom he did not officially recognize. What has changed in these 2 years? The Venetians paid more. They offered Donsky better terms, new trade privileges, loans for the restoration of devastated Moscow, support in the struggle against other princes, and in return, they demanded the replacement of the metropolitan. To remove Cyprian, the appointment of the Genoese, competitors of Venice. To install their own man, Pimen. Toktamish, who devastated Moscow, is not just a self-taught steppe nomad. He is a man who, after his defeats, fled to Kiev, to the Catholic prince Vytautas, to people connected with Venetian trading houses. Toktamish is a tool for the Venetians in their struggle against the Genoese for control over the eastern trade routes. Kulikovo Field is not a battle of Rus against the Horde. It is an episode of the grand corporate war between the Genoese and the Venetians for control over the trade routes that pass through the Russian lands, through Crimea, through Constantinople. Mamai defended the interests of Genoa. Toktamish worked for Venice. Dmitry Donskoy wavered between them, accepting one metropolitan or the other, depending on who offered better terms. But the main judge in this game, the one who confirmed the metropolitans, and thus gave the green light for a change of power, did not sit in the Sarai, not in the steppe, not in a yurt under felt. He sat in Constantinople, in the imperial palace, next to the patriarch, and his decision could also be purchased. Now, let us travel 60 years into the future. The year is 1439. An event occurs that historians present as the great attempt to reconcile the divided Christian world, the Ferrara Florentine Council. For the first time in several centuries, the Pope personally attends a church council. Usually, popes sent their legates, their representatives, but here, Pope Eugene IV comes in person. Next to him sits the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, the last emperor of a dying empire. Accompanying him is Patriarch Joseph II of Constantinople. The heads of the Eastern and Western churches at the same table for the first time since 1054, when the Great Schism split Christianity into Catholicism and Orthodoxy. The official goal is to unite the churches, to overcome disagreements, to recognize the authority of the Pope over the entire Christian world in exchange for military assistance to Byzantium against the Ottomans, who are advancing from the east. But why is this necessary right now? Why specifically in the year 1439? What has changed? Look who represents Rus at this fateful council. Metropolitan Isidore, a Greek by origin, an educated man, fluent in Latin and Greek. After the council, he will sign the Florentine Union, a document that acknowledges the Pope's authority over the Orthodox churches. He will agree to unification under the wing of the Vatican. And what will happen to him next? He will receive a purple cardinal's hat from the Pope. He will become the Latin Patriarch of Constantinople, a title that the Vatican created to govern the former Byzantine territories. He will enter the Sacred College of Cardinals. He will become one of the Pope's closest advisors. The man who came to the cathedral to represent the interests of Orthodox Russia ultimately fully switched sides to the Vatican. He became part of the Catholic hierarchy, and this is called an attempt to preserve the Orthodox faith? The council lasted 7 years, from 1438 to 1445. 7 years of negotiations, debates, and discussions about the intricacies of dogma, in an era when each day of the numerous delegations' stay cost a fortune. Hundreds of people needed to be fed: bishops, theologians, translators, servants. They required accommodation and transportation. Pope Eugene IV personally financed all of this from the church treasury. Why spend such colossal resources on negotiations for the unification of churches when it is clear in advance that this unification will not last, that most Orthodox believers will not accept it, that it will lead to a new schism? Look closely at the dates. The council ends in 1445. Constantinople will fall in 1453, an 8-year difference. The Florentine Union is not an attempt to save Byzantium by uniting the Christian world against a common enemy. It's a fire sale of assets before bankruptcy. The Byzantine Empire was engaged in trade. The emperor came to the council not for spiritual unity. He came to negotiate military aid, money for mercenaries, ships, weapons, food. He was prepared to acknowledge the Pope's authority over the Eastern Church in exchange for real military support against the Ottomans, who were already approaching the walls of Constantinople. Help was promised, but it did not arrive. Many will write that Europe failed to react to the fall of Constantinople. The Ottomans attacked suddenly. The siege was swift. No one expected it. Fine. Then explain why only 7,000 men stood to defend the city in 1453. 7,000 defenders for a huge city, the capital of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years. The Second Rome. the center of the Orthodox world, a city that Christians all over Europe considered sacred. Where are the crusaders who went to the east so many times to free the tomb of the Lord in Jerusalem? Where is the fleet of Venice, which controlled half of the Mediterranean Sea and had hundreds of war galleys? Where are the Genoese ships, whose merchants traded right in Constantinople and owned entire quarters there? Where are the troops of the Grand Duke of Moscow, who called himself the defender of orthodoxy after receiving the autocephaly of the Church? To capture Constantinople, the Ottomans needed 53 days of siege, 53 days of bombarding the walls, more than a month and a half of constant assaults. The defenders fought desperately. Every day, the Ottomans lost hundreds of soldiers trying to climb the storm ladders to the walls. Each night, the Byzantines repaired the breaches that the cannons had made during the day. 53 days is a long time for a medieval siege. In that time, one could gather reinforcements from all over Europe. Calculate the logistics. A messenger on a fast ship with a good tailwind could dash from Constantinople to Venice in 10 days. That's about 1,200 kilometers by sea. Venetian galleys of that time, under favorable conditions, could cover up to 150 kilometers a day. Let's assume the messenger arrived in Venice on the 11th day of the siege. He informed the Senate about the critical situation. Mobilizing the fleet, if the ships are already in port and the crews are ready, will take another 20 days. We need to load weapons, gunpowder, and provisions for the besieged, recruit soldiers, and pay out the first salary. The transition of the military fleet from Venice to Constantinople will take a maximum of 15 days in good weather. In total, it took 45 days from the beginning of the siege to the arrival of aid. The Venetians could have arrived a week before the fall of the city. Their fleet could have broken the blockade of the straits, bringing fresh troops, provisions, and gunpowder for the cannons. They could have landed thousands of mercenaries to reinforce the dwindling ranks of the defenders. But they did not come. Venice sent no ships, no soldiers, no barrels of gunpowder. As if Constantinople had been surrendered by agreement, the resistance was organized for show, so that later, in textbooks, one could write about the heroic defense and the tragic fall of the last stronghold of Christianity in the East. There are testimonies from eyewitnesses of the siege. The city fell not because the walls were breached by cannons. The Ottomans stormed in through a small gate that someone had opened from the inside. A small door in the massive fortress wall. It was called Cercoporta. Usually it was securely locked and bricked up, but that night it was left open. The Ottoman forces approached her stealthily, breaking inside while the main forces of the defenders were fending off the assault from the other side of the city. Betrayal? Coincidence? Or an order from above to open the gates to the enemy? Look at what happened immediately after the fall of the city. The Ottomans did not destroy Constantinople. They did not burn it to the ground, as was typically done with captured fortresses. They did not slaughter the entire population. They did not demolish Christian temples. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city, renamed it Istanbul, and declared it the capital of the Ottoman Empire. They simply changed the sign on an already completed building. The infrastructure was preserved. Byzantine officials were left in their positions, but were made to swear allegiance to the new master. Churches were converted into mosques, not destroyed, but just repurposed. The frescoes were covered up. A mihrab was installed to indicate the direction to Mecca. Green fabrics with Arabic calligraphy were hung. Essentially, it was a rebranding effort. Who benefited from this? Who gained control over the trade routes that passed through Constantinople after its fall? The Venetian bankers. the same ones who did not send a fleet to aid the besieged city. Open the trade archives. Already in the year 1454, just a year after the fall of Constantinople, the Venetian Republic concluded a peace trade agreement with Sultan Mehmed II. Venetian merchants received exclusive privileges in the new Istanbul. They were allowed to maintain trading posts, warehouses, offices, open shops, hire local workers, conduct business as if nothing had happened. The war is over, yet trade never even paused, as if the fall of the Christian capital had no impact on business relations. It's as if everything had been prearranged and agreed upon in advance. And now take a look at the weapon that the Ottomans used to breach the famous walls of Constantinople. Huge bronze cannons. One of them, according to chroniclers, had a caliber of 75 centimeters. The barrel was 8 meters long. It weighed over 17 tons. A monstrous power for the 15th century. Shells weighing half a ton penetrated walls that were 6 meters thick. Who cast these cannons? A Hungarian master named Urban, a Christian, a specialist in casting artillery, one of the best in Europe. Why would a Christian master create weapons for Muslims who were besieging a Christian city? Historians provide a convenient explanation. It is said that Urban first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI. However, the emperor was unable to pay the requested price. Upset, Urban then switched to the Ottomans, who generously rewarded him. A beautiful fairy tale. But then the question arises: where did the Ottomans, a semi-nomadic people who just 100 years ago lived in tents, suddenly find money to pay for the most expensive weapons in the world? More money than the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, which controlled trade across half of Europe. Or was someone sponsoring them? Someone who had a vested interest in the fall of Constantinople. Someone who then gained control over trade through the new Istanbul. To cast a cannon with a caliber of 75 centimeters, a blast furnace of colossal dimensions is required. Tons of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin in precisely defined proportions. Exact calculations of the barrel wall thickness to prevent the cannon from exploding upon firing. Huge molds for casting. Months of work. Dozens of craftsmen. This is not a cottage industry in a tent. This is a large-scale industrial order. Someone placed it and paid generously for it. The traces of this money, if one were to examine the banking archives of Venice and Genoa from that time, lead back to the very same banking houses that financed the Crusades, wars of European kings, and church cathedrals. Look at the architecture of Ottoman Istanbul that will emerge in the coming decades. Mosques are built in the style of Byzantine cathedrals, the same gigantic domes, the same proportions, the same engineering of vaults. Minarets are repurposed Christian bell towers and spires, only with a crescent moon on top instead of a cross. Even the main cathedral of Byzantium, Hagia Sophia, the Church of St. Sophia, was not destroyed. It was simply repurposed as the main mosque of Istanbul. The Christian mosaics were not removed, but rather plastered over, and they have survived to this day. The altar area was slightly altered, with a mihrab set at the appropriate angle. Huge round shields with Arabic calligraphy were hung up. Essentially, it underwent a cosmetic renovation. The new owners have taken over someone else's building and put up their own sign, acting as tenants who have replaced the previous owner of the office. The Ottomans were not savage invaders sweeping everything in their path. They were a new administration, new managers, hired executives placed by the same bankers who controlled Venice and Genoa. A change of signage. A rebranding of the empire into a new format. And now let's return to Rus and see what was happening there after the fall of Constantinople. We are presented with a beautiful formula. Moscow is the third Rome. The first Rome, pagan, the second, Byzantine, have fallen, while the third Rome, Moscow, stands and will stand forever. The fourth shall never be. Spiritual authority over the Orthodox world passes from the fallen Constantinople to Moscow. A great mission, a great responsibility. But look at the dates and details. Constantinople fell in 1453. The Moscow Metropolitanate received autocephaly, meaning independence from the Patriarch of Constantinople, in 1448. This was 5 years prior to the fall of Constantinople. Thus, it was not a reaction to the fall of the sacred city. It was a premeditated operation. Ivan III, the Grand Duke of Moscow, marries Sophia Palaeologus, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, only in the year 1472, 19 years after the fall of Constantinople. Why such a delay? If Moscow truly wished to become the heir to Byzantium, a marriage with a representative of the imperial dynasty should have been arranged immediately to cement legitimacy. 19 years is a long time. During this period, other dynastic marriages could have taken place. Other claimants to the Byzantine legacy could have declared their rights. So why wait? Check how the titles of church hierarchs have changed. Before the fall of Constantinople, the head of the Russian Church was called the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus. After that, it became the Metropolitan of Moscow and all Rus. A rebranding. Kiev was replaced by Moscow. But who officially confirms this title? The Patriarch of Constantinople, the very same one who now resides in Istanbul under the control of the Ottoman Sultan and Venetian bankers. The power has not moved, it has simply changed offices. The former owners remain the same. And here is the strangest detail. If Moscow is the heir of Byzantium, the rightful Third Rome, the guardian of Orthodox traditions, why is it that the very first thing Ivan III does after marrying a Byzantine princess is invite Italian architects to build the new Moscow Kremlin? Not Greek craftsmen from the fallen Byzantium, not Russian builders, Italians. Aristotle Fioravanti from Bologna, Marco Ruffo from Milan, Pietro Antonio Solari, Alevis Nu. All are Italians. All are representatives of the Venetian architectural school, where Gothic forms mingled with Byzantine traditions, creating a unique northern Italian style. Fioravanti built the Assumption Cathedral, the main temple of Moscow, over 4 years. Before arriving in Russia, he worked in Florence, Bologna, Milan, and Venice. He did not bring the Byzantine architectural tradition to Moscow. He brought Italian, Venetian. The stone hall in the Kremlin is a typical Italian palace. The Kremlin towers reflect the Italian school of fortification. The proportions, decor, and structural solutions are all Italian. There is almost nothing from Byzantium there. At first glance, it seems logical. Ivan III wanted to attract the best masters of his time, so he invited the Italians, who were at the peak of Renaissance architecture. That's all well and good. But then explain another oddity. Why did Sophia Palaeolog, this very Byzantine princess, niece of the last Orthodox emperor, not grow up in Constantinople or in some Greek monastery preserving traditions? She grew up in Rome under the personal care of the Pope. She was raised at the papal court. She was taught Latin and instilled with the Catholic faith. And then this girl, raised in the heart of the Vatican, was sent to Rus under the guise of bringing the Byzantine Orthodox heritage there. She is an agent of influence, a conduit for the interests of the same Italian banking houses that stood behind the Pope. After the fall of Constantinople, the spiritual and political authority over Eastern Christianity did not transfer to Rus as an independent state. It was placed under the control of the same forces that orchestrated the fall of Byzantium. Italian bankers positioned their people in the new Istanbul, ruled by the Ottomans, and in Moscow, where orthodoxy was formally established. Moscow received the grand title of the Third Rome, but in fact, this meant the third branch of the bank, a new department of the old financial corporation. And now let's take a broader look at the entire pattern. The Ottomans are portrayed as bloodthirsty Islamic conquerors, enemies of the Christian world, who forcibly seized ancient Constantinople. However, their behavior after the conquest is quite unlike that of fanatical enemies. They do not destroy the city. They do not expel all Christians. They do not close churches. They do not destroy Christian shrines. Moreover, Venetian merchants continue to trade in Istanbul as if nothing has changed, even gaining greater privileges than under the Byzantine emperors. Open the trade agreements that Venice concludes with the Ottoman Empire in the following years. Already in 1454, a year after the fall of the city, an official peace treaty is signed. Venetian merchants are guaranteed trade privileges, tax concessions, the right to have their warehouses and offices. They build entire quarters in Istanbul, hire local workers, trade, and earn. The war supposedly ended, but trade didn't even pause. Money flowed into the same pockets as before, only now, instead of Byzantine officials who needed to be bribed, there were Ottoman ones. The essence didn't change, only the signboard did. What about the military technology of the Ottomans? Where did they get their advanced siege technology? Already in 1454, just a year after the city's fall, Venice signs a trade agreement with Mehmed II. Venetian merchants gain privileges in Istanbul, such as customs benefits and their own quarter, as if there had been no war at all. Who specifically funded the siege? If one were to consult banking archives, the traces lead to Venetian trading houses that financed both sides of any conflict. A classic scheme, lending to both the defenders and the attackers, and making a profit regardless of the war's outcome, then approaching the victor for payment of the debts. Look broader at the entire governance system of that time. The Church in the 14th and 15th centuries is not only, nor primarily, a spiritual institution. It is an administrative machine, a bureaucratic apparatus for controlling territories and populations. The metropolitan is not chosen by the believers. He is not appointed by the local ruler. He is appointed by a joint decree of the patriarch and the emperor in a distant capital. This is a bureaucrat, an administrative manager, a representative of central authority in the regions. In the 14th century, the Patriarch of Constantinople controlled a vast territory. The metropolises in Rus, first Kiev, then Moscow, all the Balkans, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, Asia Minor, Crimea, Byzantine Italy. Through a system of appointing bishops and priests, he controlled taxes, kept track of the population, and influenced trade and politics. How did the system work in practice? Each parish, and a parish is a community of believers in a specific area, paid a church tithe, 10% of all income, from harvests, from trade profits, from craft earnings. Half of this money stayed with the local priest and was used for the maintenance of the church. The other half was sent up the hierarchy to the bishop. The bishop would send a portion to the metropolitan. The metropolitan would send part of it to the patriarch and the emperor in Constantinople. This is a tax pyramid. Money flowed from the bottom to the top, from the peasant through the priest, bishop, metropolitan, to the patriarch and the emperor. At the same time, a secular tax system existed, with funds going to princes and kings. But the church system was no less, and often more effective. Because the priest knew everything about every person in the parish, who earned what, whose child was born, who was preparing for a long journey, who was at odds with whom. Through confession, the priest obtained information that was worth a lot. The Streltsy in Pskov and Novgorod rebelled specifically against this system, against the appointment of pastors through sales, selling church positions. They saw how it worked from the inside. A person would buy a priest's position with a large bribe to the bishop. Then they would go to their parish and start extorting money from the parishioners to recoup their investments and make a profit. The church had turned into a commercial enterprise, a business for collecting taxes under the guise of spiritual leadership. Strigolnikov was executed. They threw him into the river with stones around his neck, for speaking the truth aloud, for exposing the scheme that everyone knew about, but that was not supposed to be spoken of. And so, the scale of the operation becomes evident. In Western Europe, the Catholic Church centered in Rome. In Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the Orthodox Church centered in Constantinople. Both systems are structured exactly the same. Hierarchy, appointments from the top, tithing collection, population accounting through parishes and confessions, information control through sermons, two branches of one tree, two hands of one body. Catholics and Orthodox fought in words, arguing over the subtleties of dogma, filioque, unleavened bread, purgatory. But structurally, they were identical. Both served one purpose: control over the population and collection of taxes. The Florence Cathedral of the year 1439 is not an attempt to reconcile two warring branches of Christianity for high spiritual purposes. It is an effort to unify two tax systems under a single administration, a merger of two corporations, consolidation of assets, creation of a monopoly. The Byzantine Emperor John Palaeologus arrived at the council to negotiate. He proposed to acknowledge the Pope's authority over the Eastern Church, agreeing that the Patriarch of Constantinople would be subordinate to Rome. In return, he demanded military assistance, funds for mercenaries, ships, weapons, and supplies for the besieged city. He was willing to relinquish spiritual power in exchange for material support. But the deal fell through. Why? Because someone among the players was planning not a merger of companies, but an acquisition of assets. Not a unification under one roof, but a redistribution of ownership. The destruction of one structure and the reallocation of its resources among the remaining ones. And in the year 1453, this reorganization was completed. Constantinople fell. The Byzantine tax system ceased to exist as an independent entity. Its territories partially came under the control of the Ottomans and partially under the control of new formations led by the appointees of those same Italian bankers. Moscow received autonomy and the title of the Third Rome, but in fact, it remained under the financial control of the same powers. And now, let's bring the whole picture together as a unified whole. The year 1453 is not just a date. It is a turning point, a boundary. Before it, the world looked one way. After, completely different. Until 1453, the Byzantine Empire exists, albeit weakened. Two popes are in conflict over power in Europe, one in Rome, the other in Avignon. In Rus, there is dual power among the metropolitans, either Cyprian or Piman, depending on which banking group pays more. The 100 Years' War between England and France is draining Western Europe. Dozens of independent principalities, free cities, and small states with their own laws, currencies, and armies. After 1453, Byzantium is no more. In its place is the Ottoman Empire, with its capital in Istanbul. In Europe, there is one pope, finally settled in the Vatican. In Russia, there is one metropolitan province of Moscow, holding the title of the Third Rome. The 100 Years' War has ended. The process of centralization begins. Large states absorb the small ones. Uniformity, standardization, unified systems of measures and weights emerge. A unified tax policy, a single bureaucratic machine. As if someone had activated a program to bring the whole world under one roof. Simplify the management structure. Remove unnecessary links. Who initiated this program? Look at who benefited from the events of the year 1453. Venetian and Genoese bankers gained complete control over trade with the East through the new Istanbul. They no longer needed to share profits with Byzantine officials, who were accustomed to demanding their share. The Ottoman Sultan turned out to be a more accommodating partner. The Moscow Church gained formal independence from Constantinople, autonomy, but it remains indebted to those who granted this independence, to the Italian financiers who, through Sophia Paleologue and the invited architects, established control over the Moscow Principality. The Vatican eliminated its competitor in Avignon. It strengthened its power in Western Europe. It became the sole center of the Catholic world. All threads came together in one hand. All the players have taken their places on the new board, except for one. Where have the vast territories that were marked as Tartary on medieval maps gone? We are shown maps from the 14th to 15th centuries. An enormous expanse from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic Ocean to the borders of India and China. These maps mark hundreds of cities, trade routes, political entities. It was not a desert. It was not uninhabited land. But after the middle of the 15th century, the term Tartary begins to disappear from maps. By the 17th century, it is virtually absent. The vast territory is renamed, divided, rewritten as uninhabited lands, where supposedly there was never any civilization. Where did the cities go? Where did the population go? Who cleared these territories? There is a theory that explains a lot. In the mid-15th century, a climate catastrophe of global scale began. Not an earthquake, not a tsunami, not the eruption of a single volcano. A sharp cooling across the planet. what modern scientists refer to as the beginning of the Little Ice Age. It is officially dated from the mid-15th century and lasted almost until the mid-19th century. 400 years of cold. When the average temperature on the planet drops by even 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, the consequences are catastrophic for agrarian civilization. The growing season, the time when plants can grow and bear fruit, shortens by a month. In northern latitudes, this is critical. Wheat does not have time to mature. Rye rots at the root from early frosts. Vegetables perish without yielding a harvest. The first year of crop failure, the population survives on reserves. The second year, they rely on savings. A third consecutive year of crop failure means mass famine. People begin to die by the thousands. First the children and the elderly, then everyone else. Cities that relied on food from surrounding villages are beginning to empty. No food, no city dwellers. Artisans are moving to the villages, trying to survive off the land. Merchants are closing their shops. There's nothing to trade and no one to trade with. The administration is dispersing. There's no one left to pay taxes. Trade routes come to a standstill. Caravans stop. Ports become deserted. States begin to collapse as there is no one to collect taxes and no one to serve in the army. Vast territories in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Siberia are depopulated within 1 or 2 generations. And here is an archaeological fact that is being hushed up. Across Eurasia, cities are being discovered that were suddenly abandoned by their inhabitants in the 15th century. The houses remain intact. Tools are left in place. Dishes are in the homes. But there are no people. No signs of military actions. No mass graves of epidemic victims. Just empty cities that people left and never returned to. And here is the key moment that turns the whole picture around. The fall of Constantinople, the end of the 100 Years' War, the autocephaly of the Moscow Church, the centralization of power in Europe. All of this is not the reasons for the world's reboot. These are the consequences. Someone took advantage of the climate catastrophe. They seized the vacant territories, established new rulers on the ruins of old states, rewrote history, erasing the memory of what existed before the catastrophe, created a new timeline, new heroes, new events, set new rules of the game. If you think this is a conspiracy theory, fantasy, or nonsense, that's fine. Then explain the simple facts. Why does the political map change synchronously over several years across 3 continents, in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia? Why does Tartary disappear from the maps precisely after 1450? Why does the so-called Age of Great Discoveries begin immediately after this, when Europeans suddenly discover lands that had been inhabited and developed for thousands of years? Columbus discovers America in 1492, 40 years after the fall of Constantinople. Vasco da Gama finds the sea route to India in 1497. Magellan completes the circumnavigation of the globe in 1519 to 1522. Cortés conquers the Aztec Empire in 1519 to 1521. Pizarro subdues the Incas in 1533. All of this happens in the span of a single generation. 40 years of incredible discoveries and conquests. Europeans suddenly find whole continents that they supposedly knew nothing about. They discover civilizations with millions of inhabitants, advanced architecture, writing, and astronomy, and they conquer them with just a handful of people. Cortés arrives in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, with a contingent of fewer than 600 men. The city has a population of over 200,000. According to the official version, a handful of Spaniards conquers an empire that spanned hundreds of thousands of square kilometers in just 2 years. How is this technically possible? 600 people against an army of tens of thousands of warriors. Yes, the Spaniards had firearms, but the arquebuses of that time took 2 to 3 minutes to reload. During that time, Aztec warriors could have pelted the Spaniards with stones and arrows. The Spaniards had horses, animals that the Aztecs had never seen. But there were only a few dozen horses. They were killed in the first battles. Historians usually say, Europeans won due to an alliance with local tribes that hated the Aztecs. Fine, but then this is not a discovery and conquest by the forces of Spain. This is a civil war among local peoples, in which the Europeans simply intervened on one side. And now the strangest part. Why, after the conquest of America, do they discover empty cities there? Huge stone complexes designed for tens of thousands of inhabitants, but abandoned, overgrown with jungles. Conquistadors describe ruins that appear to be hundreds of years old, yet the Aztec Empire existed before their arrival. Who, then, built these cities that stand empty? The same happened in Peru. Pizarro, with a squad of 168 men, captures the Inca Empire. The territory is larger than Europe. The population exceeds 10 million. There's an extensive road network, stone forts atop mountain peaks, an army of tens of thousands of professional warriors. 168 Spaniards capture the Incan emperor Atahualpa. They demand a ransom, a room filled with gold. The Incas pay. The Spaniards take the gold and kill the emperor. Chaos ensues. The empire collapses, not due to military defeat, but from some internal collapse, as if it was held up by one person, and as soon as he was removed, everything fell apart. It doesn't resemble a normal empire. It looks like a residual state formation, like the last ember of a civilization that was already dying. And the Europeans simply came to finish off the agonizing giant. They did not open up new lands. They seized the desolate ones. They came to territories where civilization had existed for thousands of years, but where the population had sharply declined due to some catastrophe. Climatic, epidemiological, it's unknown what kind. And they proclaimed these lands as their own, colonies, provinces, the New World, lands where there had never been true civilization, only inhabited by savages. Why do orphans suddenly appear everywhere after the year 1450? Foundlings, children without a past. They are discovered by the hundreds, the thousands. No one remembers them as infants. No one knows their parents. Look at the records of orphanages from that time. In England, in France, in Italy, in Germany. Everywhere the same picture. A sudden surge in the number of parentless children after the mid-15th century. Children appear from nowhere. They are left at the gates of monasteries, found on the roads, discovered in deserted villages. In the United States alone, though it was the 19th century, but the pattern remains the same, from 1854 to 1929, more than 250,000 orphaned children were transported from eastern cities to the Midwest. 250,000 children without parents. Where did they come from in such large numbers? Where are their mothers and fathers? There wasn't a war. The Civil War in America ended in 1865, and the orphan train program continued into the 20th century. There was no plague epidemic either. Why do historical records remain silent about a mass death of the adult population that could explain such a number of orphaned children? These children were loaded onto trains like cargo. They were transported westward. Farmers were given them as free labor. They were placed in shelters, given new names, and any memory of the past was erased. They were taught a new history. They were raised in a new faith. They were turned into people without roots, without ancestral memory. Ideal citizens for a new world where the past is erased and the future is determined by those who control the present. The outline of what happened is simple. 5 steps of a global operation. First, the synchronization of key events within a narrow time frame. Constantinople falls on the 29th of May. The 100 Years' War ends on the 17th of July. The difference is 49 days. With an information travel speed of 100 kilometers per day, this indicates centralized planning. Someone was managing the process from a single center. The second, financial strangulation through debt bondage. Venetian and Genoese bankers provided loans to both defenders and attackers. Byzantium took loans for mercenaries, the Ottomans for cannons. The victor obtained territory but remained in debt to creditors. The loser lost everything. The bankers won in any case. Then they came to the victor and dictated the terms of governance over the conquered lands. Third, the installation of new rulers. The Ottomans in Constantinople instead of the Byzantine emperors. Later, the Romanovs in Russia instead of the Rurikids. New dynasties without ties to the past, lacking legitimacy based on the antiquity of their lineage. Their legitimacy lies in the fact that they were placed by those who control the money. Fourth, establishing a unified control system through the church and bureaucracy. Taxes are collected uniformly everywhere. Population records are maintained according to unified standards. Ideology is instilled through sermons and schools. Fifth, mass production of the official version through printing presses. Gutenberg initiates printing in the mid-15th century, exactly at the moment of reboot. Before this, each copy of a book was unique. Monks could interpret the text. Now, thousands of identical copies are printed from a single matrix. Chronicles, hagiographies, and royal genealogies are published in vast editions. The sources of the texts are anonymous compilers. Verification is impossible. To doubt it is to encroach on cultural heritage. But there is another layer that we have not touched upon, the most frightening one. It is the control technologies that were implemented after the reset. Because it is not enough to simply capture territories. One must maintain power over the survivors, to break their memory, to make them forget the old world. Look at the education system that emerged right after the 15th century. Prior to this, education was fragmented. Monastic schools taught literacy through church books. Craftsmen passed on knowledge to apprentices. Merchants educated their children in arithmetic and trade within the family circle. Universities existed, but they were few in number and independent from one another. And after the 15th century, as if on command, standardization begins. The Prussian model of school education emerges. A bell for the lesson, a bell to end the lesson, classes by age, strict discipline, uniforms, a curriculum that is the same for everyone, memorization of dates, rote learning of correct answers, punishment for independent thinking. We are told that this was done for the enlightenment of the masses, to provide education to ordinary people. What a noble lie! The school of that time is not a place for personal development. It is a conveyor belt for producing obedient cogs. It is a factory of standardized minds. Imagine, if you have conquered the world after a catastrophe, you have a problem. The survivors remember how things were before. They remember other technologies, a different way of life, different city names, a different geography. They can compare. They can doubt. They are dangerous. But their children are a different matter. Children can be programmed. Give them a new history. Show them new maps. Make them learn a new chronology. And most importantly, convince them that the old folks telling stories about the past have simply lost their minds. That their memories are just fairy tales, tall tales, nonsense, not worthy of trust. The school of the 15th and 16th centuries served precisely this function. It severed children from familial memory. It replaced ancestral knowledge with a state curriculum. The child spent most of the day not with family, but with a teacher appointed by the state. The program: memorize dates, names, events. Recite them in exams. A reward for the correct answer. A punishment for attempting to think independently. In just 2 generations, familial memory faded. Children ceased to believe the tales of the elders about how the city once had a different name. Everything was deemed ignorance. Instead, a beautiful story was offered about great kings and battles that never took place. A romantic epic with heroes and morality. The children believed, and they passed this belief on. At the same time, the language was standardized alongside schools. Until the 15th century, each region spoke its own dialect. The dialects differed so greatly that a resident of one province could not understand a resident of a neighboring one. This was natural. It was normal. It was a safeguard against the centralization of power. It is impossible to govern people who do not understand orders from the capital. And so, after the 15th century, the unification of languages begins. In France, the Parisian dialect is introduced as the only correct one. In Germany, Upper German. In England, the London variant. In Russia, the Moscow dialect. All other dialects are declared illiterate, peasant, backward. Their speakers are shamed, forced to relearn. Language academies are being established. Dictionaries are being written. Grammars are being approved. All of this is done under the pretense of preserving the purity of the language and developing culture. But the true goal is control. A unified language means a unified information space. It allows commands to be communicated from the center to the farthest outposts. It allows for control over what people say and how they think. Because language shapes thought. If there is no word for a concept in a language, that concept becomes difficult to think about. If all new words are introduced from above, through academies and dictionaries, then new ideas can also be controlled. Permitted thoughts are given words. Unpermitted ones remain inexpressible. The next element of control is the creation of a unified image of the past through monuments. Look at when monuments to historical figures appear. Statues of kings, monuments to military leaders, memorial plaques on buildings with inscriptions about what happened here. Most of these monuments were created 100 to 150 years after the events they are supposedly commemorating. Monuments are erected in hindsight. By the time textbooks are already written, when there is a need to solidify a version physically, in stone, bronze, or granite, the monument materializes the myth. It is hard to doubt a person when their 3-meter statue stands in the main square. Check the dates of installation. Most of them were erected in the 17th to 19th centuries. This is not popular memory. This is a planned campaign. And another tool, print. The mass production of books is said to begin after Gutenberg invented the printing press in the mid-15th century, exactly at the same time when the reboot occurs. Coincidence? Until then, books were copied by hand. Each copy was unique. Monks could add their comments, correct mistakes, and interpret the text. Centralized control over the content was impossible. A book written in Rome could reach Paris in a completely altered form after several copies were made. The printing press changed everything. Now thousands of identical copies were produced from a single matrix. Mistakes were replicated, but so was the official version of the text. Those in power gained the ability to disseminate their truth on a massive scale, uniformly, without distortions. And immediately after the appearance of the press, the mass production of historical chronicles begins. Lives of the saints, genealogies of royal dynasties, descriptions of great battles. All of this is published in large volumes. It is distributed to monasteries, universities, and libraries. It becomes the basis for future textbooks. But where did the texts for these books come from? Who wrote them? In most cases, they are unknown authors. Chronicle monks whose names have not been preserved. Chroniclers, about whom there is no biographical data. Anonymous compilers who gathered scattered information into a unified narrative. Very convenient. It's impossible to verify the source. It's impossible to ask the author questions. It's impossible to expose a liar when there's no one there. The text exists on its own. It has been printed, distributed, spread. It has become part of the canon, and any attempt to doubt it is declared an encroachment on cultural heritage. The control system, through education, language, monuments, and print, has created a matrix from which one cannot escape without conscious effort. Most people live their lives within this matrix, unaware of its existence. For them, history is what is written in textbooks. Geography is what is shown on maps. Reality is what is affirmed by official sources. But the matrix is failing, because physical reality is stubborn. The first floors of buildings buried in dirt do not disappear just because textbooks talk about cultural strata. Megalithic structures do not disintegrate simply because they have been attributed to primitive peoples. Oddities in dating do not get resolved by ignoring them. And here is another detail that goes unmentioned: the dates we use, the chronology from the birth of Christ. We assume that it has always existed, that the Christian world has always counted the years from the birth of Christ. But this is not the case. The Anno Domini system, from the birth of the Lord, was proposed by the monk Dionysius the Small only in the 6th century. However, it began to be widely used only in the 8th to 9th centuries. It ultimately became established as the standard, as you might guess, after the 15th century. Before this, each region used its own chronology, from the founding of Rome, from the creation of the world, from the beginning of the reign of the current emperor or king, from some local event that was important for that territory. There was no unified timeline. And so, after the reboot, a unified system is introduced. All past events are recalculated and linked to the new scale. An illusion of continuity is created. It seems that the Christian world has always existed within a single temporal flow, that historians have always operated with the same dates, that chronology is unshakable and accurate. But try to find original documents dated by the Anno Domini system before the 10th century. They are practically non-existent. Almost all early datings are later recalibrations. Someone took an ancient text that stated, "in the 3rd year of the emperor's reign," and converted it into a date from the birth of Christ. How? Based on what chronology? Based on other texts that were also recalculated later. A closed circle of mutual references. And here is a question that should concern every thinking person. If this operation was carried out in the 15th century, what prevents it from being carried out again? Climate changes are occurring now. Pandemics happen. Economic crises repeat. All this has happened before. The scheme has been refined, tested, successfully implemented. We live in a world where history is a tool of control. Whoever controls the past shapes the present. Whoever shapes the present defines the future. Textbooks are written by the victors. Maps are drawn by those who have seized territories. The chronology is created by those who benefit from us not remembering the recent past. Think for yourselves. Check every date. Compare events. Calculate distances and time. Look for who benefits. Follow the money. Don't take anything at face value, neither history textbooks, nor official versions, nor me. Because the truth is always more valuable than a comfortable lie. It demands effort. It shatters our familiar worldview. It intimidates. But it is worth it. Because only by understanding how we were controlled in the past can we avoid manipulations in the present. Only by knowing how the Great Reset of the 15th century was structured can we recognize the signs of a new one being prepared. The system works only while we sleep. While we believe in beautiful tales about heroes and exploits. While we refrain from asking uncomfortable questions. But once we wake up, the house of cards begins to tumble. Once we start counting, the numbers don't add up. Once we compare, there turn out to be too many coincidences. And here are the signs that the system is preparing for the next cycle. Pay attention to the discourse of recent years. Conversations about the Great Reset are being held openly. Representatives of the global elite are speaking these words from podiums. They are writing books. They are holding forums. They explain that the old world has exhausted itself, that a new order is needed, new rules, a new economy, a new society. We are told that this is about technology, about digitalization, about green energy, about sustainable development. Beautiful words, a wrapper for the essence. And the essence is the same as it was 600 years ago. A reconfiguration of ownership, a takeover of control. The erasure of the past and the construction of a new future. The climate agenda functions similarly to the Little Ice Age in the 15th century. It creates an atmosphere of crisis. It justifies emergency measures. It enables the introduction of restrictions and changes to the rules of the game under the pretext of saving the planet. Those who do not agree are labeled as enemies of humanity, science deniers, dangerous extremists. Pandemics function as a tool for controlling movement and social connections. Lockdowns accustom people to the restriction of freedom. Pass system creates a precedent for surveillance. Mandatory procedures foster a habit of unquestioning obedience. All of this has been tested for centuries. It works flawlessly. Economic crises erase the savings of the middle class. They transfer property from many to a few. They create a multitude of people dependent on state assistance, controlled through benefits and support programs, ready to accept any conditions for a piece of bread. Digitalization provides tools for control that the organizers of the 15th century reboot could only dream of. Centralized accounting of the entire population through databases, tracking every movement through geolocation, monitoring every purchase through electronic payments, controlling every statement through social networks. The ability to disconnect an undesirable individual from all services with the push of a button. Schools are becoming centers of ideological conditioning even more openly than in the 16th century. Children are being instilled with new values. They are taught a new history, where the past is rewritten to fit the current political climate. A new identity is being formed, based not on family and nation, but on abstract global categories. A unified language is transforming into a controlled speech. Forbidden words are introduced. Mandatory phrases are established. Incorrect statements result in sanctions, ranging from social media bans to job termination. An atmosphere of fear is created, where one is afraid to say the wrong thing, to think differently, to doubt in the wrong place. New monuments tear down the old ones. Statues that have stood for centuries are declared symbols of oppression and dismantled. The names of cities and streets are changed. History is being rewritten in real time. And in a generation, no one will remember what came before. Just as in the 15th century, Tartary was forgotten. Just as in the 19th, the pre-cataclysmic civilization was forgotten. There are no coincidences. There are patterns. There is a system. There is a plan. And this plan has been working for 600 years. But now you know how it's structured. You know what to pay attention to. You know the questions that need to be asked. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not a random military defeat. It was an operation to change the system of world governance. The end of the 100 Years' War, the return of the popes to the Vatican, the autocephaly of Moscow, links in the same chain. The Little Ice Age, the disappearance of Tartary, the conquest of America, the consequences of one catastrophe that someone exploited to seize power. And the most important thing is to understand that history repeats itself not because people do not learn from mistakes, but because someone intentionally repeats successful patterns. If it worked 600 years ago, it will work now. If, of course, we allow it. Think for yourself. Compare. Count. Ask uncomfortable questions. Don't take things at face value. Verify every fact. Look for patterns. Keep an eye on those who have something to gain. Remember, whoever controls the past shapes the future. History is a battleground, and this battle is ongoing right now.